Welcome, comrades. You're listening to The Party Line, a podcast from The Ditch, news and comment from Ireland on theditch.com. I'm Harry Browne.
And I'm Niamh Ní Bhriain, and you can follow The Party Line wherever you watch or listen to your podcasts, and follow The Ditch on all your apps where you can like, subscribe, give us 5 stars, and also tell your friends about us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So today we're joined by Eoghan McNeill from The Ditch, and then we're also absolutely delighted to welcome Clare Daly, former TD and MEP, and also, represented Dublin, but not just Dublin, Ireland. I would say also the European peace movement, the international peace, anti-war movement, anti-genocide movement, so well for 5 years at the European Parliament. So we're delighted to have Clare with us today.
My honour. Thank you very much, Niamh.
Oh, it's all ours. We're going to talk to Clare about Europe, of course, and its place in the wider world, but we're going to talk about lots of other things besides, including the state of the left and the right in Ireland, especially after the by-elections we've just seen. But first on the agenda, as every week, is our regular check-in with The Ditch. What's in the ditch, Eoghan?
We were doing a bit about Patrick O'Donovan, who is the Arts, Culture and Media Minister. And on that as well, I always think, there are certain ministers where you kind of go, like politics or ideology aside, it's like, how suited are they to their brief? And it's like Patrick O'Donovan is the Arts, Culture and Media Minister.
Right.
And, when he does, we had a story about his interactions with the media and about during the fuel protest coverage, he made remarks on, it was local radio stations in Tipperary, Limerick and Waterford, where he said he didn't like the way, it was mainly RTE he was talking about, that he didn't like the way that they were covering the fuel protests. And he said that he was going to go and ask Commission the Man if, he was kind of playing the big man on local radio like that. He said that he was going to ask Commission the Man if there was a way that they could initiate a review of the way that RTE covered these protests. And the way that he put it was, he said, look, I'm certainly going to ask the question, right? Mm-hmm. And that was back in April. But the story that we published, and we talked about the language of it, what we went with was he didn't admit that he had already got in touch with a Commission Man commissioner, a guy called Ronan O'Donnell, and had asked him if there was, he had asked if there was a way that he could trigger a state examination of media coverage he didn't like. And, one of the examples he gave was that there was an RTE journalist broadcasting from an unauthorised porta-cabin.
An unauthorised porta-cabin, the shame.
Lack of government voices in some of the coverage. That James Geoghan, one of the protest spokespeople, that he was treated too softly. And, he asked this commissioner, could he trigger legislation that would force a review of this coverage? He also asked the commissioner if he could speak to his colleagues and kind of drum up support for this. Yeah. And then it was a couple of days later. Now, it depends now, knowing what we know now from what we reported on, you kind of go, okay, so when he was on local radio, was he trying to force Commission the Man's hand after having already made the request?
So he'd initiated it, he was trying to get them to step it up, basically.
Or was he saying... Or was he kind of internally saying, oh, fuck, I kind of, maybe I shouldn't have done that?
I'm sure he doesn't curse in his internal monologue.
Yeah. And look, we reported it, have it on good authority. He didn't comment to us. Have it on very good authority that the reason he didn't comment is that his team completely accept the facts and the veracity of what we reported.
Yeah, this was based on an FOI from the Media Commission itself, the documents that you had that showed that he'd made this call. He'd reached out before he said, I'm going to reach out.
Yeah. And also on that, have to say that it was, I think it was a slightly unconventional or unorthodox record for Commission Man to keep. I'm very happy that they kept it. I'm very happy that they released it to us. And I think that there was a reason why they kept a sort of a record like that. This was, I think it's funny, with someone like Patrick O'Donovan, you kind of go, and I can say this as a headbanger from the country myself, you see him as a headbanger from the country who's just kind of, bumbling around and all the rest. What he did was actually quite serious, that it was. And also, I can say this as someone who worked for state media over in China, that this was a real overreach from a government minister really just about, I mean, we've spoken about the field protests. Like this was a real flashpoint where government and, arguably we could say the state was under real popular pressure. It was a real moment of weakness for the state and government, and this is how they reacted to go after poor RTE.
Yes.
Puts us in an awkward position where we're going to bat for RTE.
Yeah, but that was in April, of course, and some of this, of course, did come out at the time because he was in public saying these things, and we had denunciations from the NUJ, and he did back down a little bit at the time. But what we've got is a kind of a new insight into how it played out. And of course, RTE have covered this story without crediting the Ditch for going there first, and they've covered it in kind of a funny way that didn't really deal with, if you like, the question of the timing.
Yeah, so like RTE covered it after us, and they just sort of went with, this is what Patrick O'Donovan said about us, and these are the problems he had with our coverage. But they didn't touch the aspect of, as I said, the language we went with. He didn't admit to this secret phone call, which was kept up, by the way, like a separate thing. Then we also followed it up with, when he finally did have his meeting with Commission Demand, his departmental records doesn't refer to that secret phone call that he had, where, as I said, he tried to get this review going, and he also tried to get this commissioner to go and drum up support for it.
Exactly, yeah. Good story.
Okay.
Thanks, Eoghan, for that.
The irony of their defence constantly and lecturing of other countries about media freedom, and we're the democratic ones. We did all these authoritarian countries that interfere with their media, and here we are.
Yeah, and I can never tell sometimes whether it's cynicism on their part when it comes to state media and how it's different in other countries. How we're different, and we're so lucky to have the likes of RTE here, and we're so lucky to have a supportive government that gives us 750 million.
Yeah, I mean, they self-censor, really. It's unusual that they would do anything that upsets the master, generally. You couldn't really get a more compliant state media, so it is unusual when they clash sometimes,
It was interesting in that particular context of that protest, but the unauthorized Portakabin is just gaslighting. Like a reporter who went out into the field, found the people who were doing the protest, went where they were so that he could interview them and report from there, and that was the crime in the eyes of the minister.
But he's a special one, as you said. He's a bit special.
Yeah, we love our headbangers.
Okay, so moving on, we have, as usual, our non-ditch media. And we have picked two pieces that have a European Union connection. And hopefully, Claire, you can come in on both of these. But the first one was a piece published in Bloomberg, and it is Ireland aims to join the next phase of the flagship EU Defence Loan Fund. And it is about Helen McEntee saying that, quote, we should have joined when it opened the last time. And then she goes on to say that she is, quote, really ambitious for Ireland. So there's this idea that being ambitious involves Ireland participating in the next round of basically a fund that is really questionable in terms of its legal basis. So it's the Security Action for Europe Fund, the SAFE Fund. I think they thought they were very clever with this acronym, SAFE. So it's a fund that we should all consider as keeping us safe. It's a 150 billion euro loan programme. So basically it is part of the EU. So last year we had the European Union roll out its Defence Readiness 2030 package, which is 800 billion euros worth of measures that will see Europe remilitarise, further militarise, deepen its militarisation by basically stretching to breaking point the European Union's fiscal rules to allow all sorts of measures to be put in place so that we will be spending unprecedented amounts on militarisation. And SAFE is a part of that, so it's 150 billion euros worth of loans that can be drawn down by European Union member states to jointly procure weaponry. And so the first 150 billion basically went in a flash. It was already drawn down at the time. So this came into force last. I think it was last May when it was enacted. And at the time, the Irish government had said that it was considering drawing down funds and applying for funds from SAFE. In the end, it actually didn't. And now we have Helen McEntee coming around again saying, well, actually, if SAFE opens up again, a further pool of money beyond the 800 billion, if it opens up again, that we will consider applying. And this is after last September, the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Finance, which is chaired by Sinn Féin's Mairead Farrell, they actually held a scrutiny committee on SAFE because of the fact that it is on such a shaky legal basis. And their report that they published just before Christmas from the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Finance, it has recommended that the state, the Irish state, should oppose, this is a direct quote, should oppose the use of the EU's general budget to which Ireland is a contributor as a guarantee for defence-related loans. The committee also expressed concern with measures allowing the redirection of EU existing cohesion funds towards defence purposes, and also highlighted how these funds would be in conflict with the Irish constitution and neutrality. So that's an Oireachtas Joint Committee saying that last Christmas in respect of the redirection of European Union funds, and in particular SAFE, towards militarisation. And now we have Helen McEntee only a few months later saying, well, actually, if the fund comes around again, which it looks like it might, Ireland should be ambitious and delve into this pool of money.
Yes, mad one, isn't it? Yet another mad one to add to all the other acronyms that we have out there for defence expenditure. And the reality is that the only show in town now in terms of funding is coming through defence expenditure, which shows the bankruptcy really of European politics at the moment, in that there is no way out. They have deindustrialised the continent, basically, in part with their self-sanctions in response to the war on Ukraine, and the only money is there for supposedly competitiveness and defence. And of course, as you say, it is illegal for the budget to spend money directly on defence, and yet we have a defence commissioner. How could that be? It can't be, but the only way they get away with it is by doing it in the context of trade. So it's business, and actually this is business led by the industry, who are the ones who they go to first on all of these things. And the idea that Ireland would participate in that, a fund which was set up and robs funds from other areas potentially as well, it's not surprising, we have to be honest. This is the trajectory they've been on for many years now. We've seen it in so many other programmes. The softening up has been going on, but it's a serious enough step, all right, and people should be worried about it. I mean, all of the European billions now are going on defence. People may have seen when Micheál Martin met the Pope. I felt sorry for the Pope, actually, over the weekend. God help him having to listen to that. Trump's bad enough, but having Micheál Martin as well was really adding to the burden. But,
his penance.
His penance, indeed. And he said Ireland's presidency is obviously starting next month. Every country, when it heads the European Council, has a chance to put its stamp on its mandate. Now, they don't tend to announce it in advance. They say it's like, announcing your engagement at a wedding. You don't spoil someone else's go. But Micheál then said, our presidency will be dictated and governed by security and competitiveness. I mean, come on.
Yeah. It is kind of as well, like, the Irish experience, I think, it remarkably shows the absurdity and the farce of all this, given that, we're on the far, far western flank. We are occupied by a NATO member. So what are we actually spent? Like, obviously, it's not absurd where, it's being used to drum up activity in European markets across the continent, but at least certain countries in Europe can fall back on some of that mainstream propaganda about the Russian threat, or et cetera, whereas this small island far off in the Atlantic.
Well, it's gained a lot of currency. I mean, I remember when we were in the European Parliament at the start, a big row developing, and this big, huge Polish fella sitting beside me going on about the Russian threat. Now, this would have been before the war in Ukraine, and I was kind of going, excuse me, sorry now, I don't think the Russians are any threat to us. And he nearly got apoplectic, that it's all right for you over on the other side. You don't know what it's like, And I said, excuse me, sorry. And we actually do. We also have a big aggressive neighbour who occupies occupied us on our doorstep, but our solution wasn't to rearm the IRA. It was a peace process, and that's what we should be doing. We share a continent with Russia, but it's absurd. But even in the time since then, so 5 or 6 years ago, now the mainstream media is full of Russian threats, and with the Irish presidency you can be guaranteed there'll be drone sightings, there'll be surveillance, there'll be all sorts of nonsense day in, day out that the Russians are coming even though they're not.
And like we get all that bullshit about how, like, you know, you'll see it in the Irish Times or in RTE, you know, like one of those commentators who will say, oh, imagine telling someone from a Baltic state that we don't care about the Russian threat. Well then, how about, like, are there people over in the Baltics going, imagine telling an Irish person not to worry about the Brits? Like, you know, it's just like, this is how it is. Like, you know,
and that was always our unique legacy, that we are a very firmly, if you like, sort of Western European country at the heart of the European Union, but with a history of occupation and that sympathy to the global south. And that's what all of this increased militarisation is creeping into and undermining. It's part of a softening up of Ireland, a gradual salami tactics from the very beginning, this process of directing the European Union towards defence expenditure and defence union has been ongoing, obviously, since Lisbon, Nice, probably beforehand. But the agenda that's playing out now is an agenda which was dictated by the arms industry. They were the ones who decided the policy, and they're the ones who get the ear first on the money. And it's they're getting the spoils, and it's 3 or 4 countries that get the bulk of that money. I remember raising at committees as well about kind of, well, this is of no benefit to Ireland. And they said, relax, Ireland can bid as well. You can bid too, you know. And that's what the government are doing.
That is the plan.
We can get money. Did you see the thing? Ireland got an award for this military, what was the thing?
In the
this
US,
week,
the use
in
of the
the
tanks.
US, this the most lethal weaponry contest, the Bradley sort of thing, and Ireland win it. And they, isn't this wonderful? And we were never even trained in it. We are great. I mean, talk about blowing all of that sort of diplomatic capital
And
for
of course,
something that's not going to gender any money. It's not a solution to the economic problems of Europe, converting car factories into guns factories and then using
because
it
necessarily then requires a war eventually for
absolutely.
it to, like, you know, and it's kind of, there's no alarm bells going off for anyone. It's constantly being presented as though this is a great opportunity. Again, the word like ambitious is constantly rolled out. And also just with SAFE, like even if Ireland doesn't participate, because at the moment we're not, but the idea is that we would eventually. And this came up in the Oireachtas committee. Even if we don't participate, if, for example, Poland, which is one of the biggest countries drawing down loans, if Poland draws down a loan and then it defaults on that loan, we as a contributor to the EU budget necessarily have to pick up the bill. So we're already on the hook for this stuff.
The other thing is that the British, the Irish government has supported the idea that the British should have access to this program. Britain not in the EU, of course. But the Irish want Britain to be a full partner in this regard. There's another story that we looked at as well, which is actually quite related in many respects. Another piece quoting Helen McEntee, indeed, and her regrets. The first piece, she regretted that Ireland didn't get in on the first phase of the SAFE program. This time she regrets that Ireland is coming out of Operation Irini in the Mediterranean. So this is a piece in the Journal by Niall O'Connor, who apparently got out to Rome to visit the Irish.
He loves his trips.
He loves his trips. So he was out in Rome with the forces. And this operation, which had been designed to stop the flow of arms supposedly to Libya, is being reformulated as an operation against the Russian threat, of course. And as such is unlikely to receive, and in fact the French who lead it are not going to bring it to the UN to get another UN mandate for it. And Helen McEntee regrets that we have to come out because of the triple lock, because of the necessity of a UN mandate. Actually, the number of Irish personnel involved is smaller than the triple lock rules would normally involve, but because of the sensitivity of this one, the triple lock supposedly applies. But this is all part of softening us up for, we really need to get rid of this triple lock because there's this wonderful multilateral operation in the Mediterranean that we're being stopped from participating in because of the triple lock. The situation and necessity to withdraw Defence Forces personnel from this mission illustrates clearly the constraints in which we have to operate because of the requirements of the triple lock, Helen McEntee said.
But the thing with Operation Irini, which is not, I mean, there's so much wrong with Operation Irini, it's hard to know where to start. Ireland should never have been part of it in the first place. maybe just to set out what's wrong with it, because probably very few people know. But so first you had Operation Sophia, and that did have that was also problematic. It was an EU mandated mission. It was problematic, but at least it had a search and rescue component to it, so that if somebody is drowning at sea, that Operation Sophia would have stepped in and they would have saved lives. And Ireland participated, and there was, scenes where Irish troops were coming home and they were being celebrated as having saved lives at sea. And then that went from being Operation Sophia with a mandate to save lives, became Operation Irini, which is the next kind of rollout of an EU mandated mission on the Mediterranean Sea. And the mandate was very much about having an arms embargo, a UN-sanctioned arms embargo on Libya. That was the pretext for the EU mission, and it had a UN mandate, and therefore Ireland could participate. But it was problematic because it had no search and rescue mandate. And therefore, the fact that that wasn't explicitly stated was then used by the troops who were put to sea to say, well, we don't have to save people who are drowning at sea, basically, which is a violation of international maritime law. So it basically normalised allowing people in distress at sea to be left to drown. And so in that gap where there's literally nobody saving lives in the Mediterranean Sea, that gap is then filled by groups like Open Arms, Doctors Without Borders for a time had a ship, Sea-Watch had a ship, who, even Tunisian fisher folk who were out fishing and saw people drowning, they end up stepping in, and Italian fisher folk, they end up stepping into this gap where there's nobody saving lives at sea and saving people's lives, and then they get criminalised as being smugglers. So you had a very what's the word I'm looking for? A case that was taken against people in Italy charged of smuggling. Smuggling because they basically saw people drowning at sea and brought them to the nearest port of safety, which is not Libya, because Libya, we have enough documentation to know, we have a number of UN reports to tell us Libya is not a safe country. You cannot take people back to Libya. And so you had Operation Irini, which is collaborating with the so-called Libyan Coast Guard to drag people back to Libya, to then put them into EU-funded detention centres, which are actually torture camps, and then sold. Literally human beings being bought and sold in human auctions in Libya. So that's Operation Irini. It's hugely problematic. We should never have been part of it. And it just goes to show that even if something has a UN mandate, the government should still scrutinise whether or not Irish troops should be part of that mission. That also goes for the approval of the latest UN mandated mission that could potentially deploy to Palestine, which is also hugely problematic. But now we have a winding down of that mandate, and instead of reporting that Operation Irini is being wound down in its current form, and now there's this new mission being imagined where the European Union would be out in force to stop Russian so-called shadow fleet ships in the Mediterranean. Instead of actually giving that context, it's, well, now we can participate in this Operation Irini, which is supposedly about peace because it's somehow connected to an arms
because
embargo.
of the dirty old triple lock. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, it's quite deliberate. The timing is very, very obvious because, as you've said, Harry, the triple lock actually doesn't even apply in this situation, even though we shouldn't have been involved in it from the beginning. We've had 3 or 4 or 5 people involved in it, so it's under the 12. But yeah, there's no accident that they're coming out with this now. The mandate is changing completely. You're totally right. We should never have been involved in that. I mean, the horrors that they participated in that Operation Irini, we used to have them coming in before the Parliament. This was about police and migration, really, and they are undoubtedly have been responsible for deaths and to returning people to appalling conditions, unlike the previous missions where the Irish Defence Force, in fairness, really, and they benefited enormously themselves out of that experience of actually going on a humanitarian search and rescue. But the ethos of the European Parliament is migration is now a threat as well, because everything we deal with is militarised. So migration is a threat, and we deal with it militarily and let them drown, because if you don't let them drown, you're facilitating piracy or whatever, you know. And it was actually an Irish guy was prosecuted executed in Greece. We were out there when we were in the Parliament as well for one of those search and rescue missions as well. And indeed many migrants themselves who put a hand on a wheel of a boat that was going to sink was done for, one of them got 120 years in prison, a guy we went to see in Greece, because he tried to save the boat. But once you touch that handle, or whatever you call the thing, the steering deck thing on a boat, that was deemed to be, you steer that ship, so you're
trafficking.
You're trafficking or you're smuggling, and it's...
So imagine that our Defence Force would be involved in that. Unreal.
So that's a lot of Helen McEntee's regrets that we've dealt with.
She's been very vocal and busy on this, and it gives you a taste of what we're going to be listening to for the next 6 months now when they take the presidency. It's not going to be nice.
She's another Patrick O'Donovan, though, where I'm like, there are certain Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil politicians where I understand their politics and their ideology, what they believe and what they're advancing. Helen McEntee as Foreign Affairs Minister, like, what is your worldview? Like, what exactly are you building for Ireland, advancing for Ireland? Like, what is the actual vision? Even if it's one that I don't believe in myself, like, what is it?
I think their vision is total subservience to the European Union. They come from that class of people who are just love Europe. Like, they're the same class of people who years ago here loved the Brits. They want to be in with the master, and anything that's Irish and different is inherently embarrassing. We were an embarrassment and a disgrace because we didn't go along with everyone else. Oh my God, the embarrassment. We'd be making a show of ourselves with our European friends. But actually, and as the safe scrutiny by the Finance Committee shows, Ireland is one of the few countries, we're the only people who get a chance at a referendum. It's great that the Oireachtas Committee did scrutinise it, because I can guarantee you no such scrutiny has applied anywhere else in Europe. And we know the citizens of all the other European countries are pretty much like the Irish ones. They prefer to have their money being spent on, a roof over their head, a pension, health service, rather than their young fellas being frog-marked into a sort of cannon fodder for European wars, which is the only future that's being developed for them. If you're a German young fella now, you're engaged in complete propaganda all the time. The Russians are coming, we have to rearm up to 2030. It's going to take us that length of time to match the Russians. No jobs, all deindustrialisation. So go into the car factories, and then those of you are into the bomb factories now that used to be car factories, and those of you that don't make that, you can go to the front lines now. And off you go, and the rest of you follow them.
And it's also, like, I saw it a lot in the Netherlands, the reorientation of your entire state to put it on a, quote, war footing. So like in the Netherlands, for example, the health system started actually training their healthcare staff to deal with war wounds. You have, lots of university research funding programs are now being given precedent if they have, being given more importance if they have a military dimension to them. So it's like this reorientation of your healthcare, of your education system, your transport. Like, we now have the idea that we will have a military Schengen. That's not an expression that, we should all be terrified of that. But there's this idea that there will now be the ability to move large numbers of troops overland, very quickly, that we will, change legislation at a domestic level so that, for example, the troops from the Netherlands can travel into Germany without problems. So it's the total erosion of the nation state without actually asking the people so that we can prepare
and European infrastructure itself is crumbling at the same time, so people can't transit smoothly now. Trains are not running on time. The infrastructure is outdated, needs investment, but they're revamping it to cater for military mobility rather than anything else.
And then even all of those things, education, healthcare, transport, obviously all heavily financialised, right? And when they are financialised, they don't work for people. It's the same with the military as well. Like, when we've seen the US experience in Iran, when the military and that whole industry is so heavily financialised, works great for arms makers, it works great for people who have invested in those. It doesn't actually create a good military, though, either.
As a matter of fact, we've got a topic on that coming up in a future episode, so we definitely will be probing that. Claire, do you miss being stuck into these issues on a day-to-day basis? You're 2 years out of the European Parliament.
Look, we certainly very much feel the loss of the platform. I mean, when we were there, we felt it was very unrepresentative of the citizens of Europe, and we were able to develop it as a platform which echoed even beyond Europe. We used to have staff coming up to us all the time, the translators in the booths going, I love when you and Mick speak, you're the ones representing us. Whereas if you'd read the media, it was completely different. And looking now at how much worse the world is, even in those 2 years, and there's nobody even speaking out. I do feel bad for that, but on a personal level, no, it's been grand. I mean, to me, politics, okay, I was an elected politician for 25 years, but my political activism started well before that. Politics is life, it's everything. So this is just a different form. And I suppose it gave me the freedom to do, because of the international profile we've done a lot of peace work around Europe. We were in Bucharest 2 weeks ago at a conference from Palestine to the Black Sea against a big Black Sea defence conference. Managed to get to Iran twice last year, to Yemen at various events, solidarity events for Palestine and that. So we're still active and all of that.
Office or no office.
Yeah.
I mean, the last race that you ran was in Dublin Central, of course, and we've just had a by-election there. What did you make of that? How did that feel watching that play out?
Look, that was just a little bit of a, I don't, to use Owen's words, sort of fuck you. It was we had never really intended to run again for Europe, but I mean we did want to then this time when we'd been there, because we saw how much we developed it as a platform. That didn't happen. We were obviously demonised in a really terrible way and misrepresented by the media, and I didn't want to sort of say, I'm afraid to stand. Do you know what I mean? I wanted to look at I'd wanted to get, and we did fight Dublin Central to win. There were a lot of groups in the area who represented that strong independent voice who asked me to run then. I think if Gerard Hutch hadn't run then, the outcome would have been different for us, because there was a space for that independent voice, but he kind of got it. But it's certainly, we had a great campaign. We got an absolutely fantastic response. But I wasn't rooted in that area. I wasn't from that area. And if you're getting elected to the Dáil, if you're not representing, you have to kind of have that. So I was interested looking on. I mean, there weren't many high-profile people. By all accounts, it would appear, and anything I'd heard previously, Daniel Ennis seems to be a good guy. He has huge respect locally. He does seem to be a very hard worker. And it must be a bit worrying for Sinn Féin, I would imagine, with the two by-elections. But I understand why he would have won that area. I mean, people think Dublin City, Dublin Central is real working class, and, East Wall and the North Inner City. Come on, lads, it's, gentrified. Cabra isn't gentrified, but Stoneybatter, Phibsborough, Drumcondra, Glasnevin, big money, big low turnout-ish by-elections, not too different than a normal by-election, but less, the working class stayed at home, and middle class people wouldn't have voted for that Sinn Féin candidate.
But Sinn Féin would be worried, you reckon, all the same from that outcome?
I'd be more worried about their vote in Galway if I was them as well. I mean, obviously they had been polling well in Dublin Central. I was kind of surprised with the candidate. I know Janice Boylan is obviously a local councillor as well. But I didn't think she would transfer well to that middle class side of the constituency. So not a great candidate in that sense. But the vote in Galway, where obviously Mairead Farrell topped the poll the last time, and that was abysmal. I don't care who your man was or how unknown he was. You'd have to say there were a problem. And it does show for the left in general now. What does this mean? Because people will look at the election of Sean Kine and say, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, what does this government have to do to stop people voting for them? But, I mean, there were a lot of, we'll call them, it really pains me to call them left candidates, but we'll call them soft left candidates. The vote was really split. They're going to have to, if there's going to be an alternative government after the next election, they have to get their act together. And it does mean going into every constituency, having a hard discussion with people, literally saying, OK, there's 6 of us here in the different parties who've been ploughing away as local councillors or whatever. We're not even going to get 6 seats. There isn't 6 seats here. There's 2 or there's 3. These are the 3 people. We're going to come in under this umbrella, and I'm sorry for you that you've been doing the work, but we have to maximise these seats. And unless they do that, we're going to have Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael back next time as well, probably with some of those others, you know.
What about the right then? I mean, obviously the government is of the right, but there's the right and then there's the right, and Malachy Steenson nearly doubled his vote in Dublin Central this time around, and Hutch increased his vote, not by anything like as much.
Yeah, and I think they're different people and they were different votes. And I mean, you're right that the close of the right, and I would consider Gerard Hutch a bit different than Malachy, even though he did play a bit of the race card during this time, but he very much wasn't that way the last time. But the robbing the close of racism and division has been the tactic of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, really. They're there, they need to be dealt with, but my attitude all along to that is that we are where we are because the left has abandoned working class communities and nobody is articulating the pain that people are feeling and suffering in modern Ireland, and they see other people being pandered to, and it's easy to sow the seeds of division then, you know. So it's it's a worry, but it will only be overcome by the way it always is, intervening on the ground on class issues being the dominant issues facing people, and linking it, as we have done, to the whole issue of neutrality in these things, because they are linked. If you're spending money on military hardware, you're not spending on housing and all of these things, and the whole privatisation agenda and that too. So yeah, it's worrying, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who vote for what we would, people like Noel Thomas or whatever, they're not all dyed-in-the-wool racists or anything like that. They're people who are really fed up with the system. They're fed up being lectured to, talk down to by people who have a holier-than-thou attitude. It's a class prejudice, really, of looking down to working-class communities and abandoning them, and people are sick of it.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, but it is. It needs to be challenged, but by uniting people on the ground, which is a long, hard struggle, and it's the abandonment of that struggle that has got us to the situation where we are now, with the neglect of huge parts of Ireland, both in cities but also rurally as well,
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe just thinking, it's nearly 2 years since the European Parliament elections, and I remember after yourself and Mick Wallace didn't get elected, getting loads of emails to my email account from people in different kind of anti-war groups around Europe, kind of bewildered, going, what's going on in neutral Ireland? There's these two people who've been such a strong voice at the European Parliament opposing war, and at that point also opposing genocide. And Ireland is supposedly, stands with Palestine and all of this. It's neutral, it opposes war. How people just couldn't understand what's going on in Ireland, that ye haven't re-elected these two voices. And it's kind of that, it was kind of trying to explain what's going on in Irish politics to a European audience so that they could understand how we have a situation where we have such strong voices that oppose these things that didn't manage to get
I suppose
re-elected.
that kind of story tells two sides of things. One is how we were viewed in Europe. And we can literally go to countries where we would have had MEPs from many different countries coming up to us all the time wanting to do selfies. They could have been the far right, they could have been the Social Democrats, they could have been anybody. Oh, my brother loves you, or my friend, can I get into a selfie with you? Everybody knew us in an institution where hardly anybody is known in their own country, not to mind in a different one, So we had that sort of credibility, and then you compare that to how the media portrayed us, that it was sort of presented. Claire and Mick went to Europe and went mad. Oh my God, they're the friends of all these lunatics, and they lost the plot. Even though everything we said and did was everything the same as we did when we were in the Dáil. We got criticised, of course, by the same media when we were in the Dáil. The difference was we were there on the ground. People could see us on Oireachtas TV. When you're in Europe, you have that disconnect, so we were able to counteract that. They knew us, really, so that didn't really stick. But yeah, I mean, I think, but what happened was, really, we nearly won. That's more the thing, and it wasn't that we were defeated. I know some pathetic journalists who really don't like us said we were rejected. Now, the Greens weren't rejected, they just lost their seats. Everybody who didn't get elected lost it, but we were rejected. Actually, we weren't. Mick came in with a hair's breadth of getting elected, and it was just the bizarre situation whereby the Greens transferred almost en masse to Fianna Fáil for that last seat. And the truth is about the vote in Dublin was we withstood a lot of that. I mean, I did obviously get the Russian agent, Kremlin agent nonsense regularly during the campaign, but the work in Palestine had, undid that. It was people before profit splitting the vote, and that was simply it. And we had the discussions with them in advance. My own feeling is that they probably thought that the media had done such a job on us over years. I remember very early into the mandate, one of the seasoned Sinn Féin staff members based out in Brussels saying to me, Claire, you do realise that a lot of this actually is aimed at you more than Mick, because it's that Dublin constituency of targeting that sort of soft level of support that I would have got because of being known as a pretty competent, articulate politician, the work on abortion, anti-Garda corruption, all of those things. We'd a really high, they wanted to chip away at that. I think people before profit saw that, felt that we were damaged, thought that they could get more votes than me and then take that seat. But obviously they didn't, and they were never going to. And we told them that will never happen. I said, you'll just give it to somebody else. And I actually think that's a crime, not personally because of me or anything, but because we've lost. And even if they hadn't got elected, I don't think they would have been as good at the role as we were. No. Because we're independent, unaligned, and we use that platform. We used to jokingly, when we were standing for the Euros first time around in 2019, people would say, actually, European elections, a load of people didn't want us to go because they loved us being in the Dáil. And the waste, nobody does anything in Europe. And we said, well, look, have you heard of Nigel Farage? Yeah. Well, look what he's done. He's used completely different basis, obviously, but he's used it as a platform for his ideas, and he's done it brilliantly. We will use that as a platform as well. And as it happened, when the war in Ukraine happened, even though it could be viewed as the worst of times, it was actually the best of times for us to be there, like to be able to call for peace. Again, in a war, that's what peace campaigners should be doing, but unfortunately most of the left capitulated. So we nearly did it. Yeah. We really nearly did, and that's where that crime was. That's unfortunately we didn't, and it is a loss, and people in every country see it. As I was saying, we were at that event in Romania a couple of weeks ago, and there were people there from Bulgaria, from Serbia. All of these people still remember the work, and they were even raising that question now. People in Italy say it to us all the time.
Yeah.
Whatever about the mainstream media, right, which still, by and large, their editorial line is, we love the EU, we love NATO, here's some blind Europhilia.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years down the line, do you think do you think that public sentiment has changed for better or worse when it comes to that sort of blind Europhilia?
Well, obviously Ursula has been a key factor in changing that, and Europe's open support for the genocide was an absolute... It was a culture shock for loads of people who actually bought that, and not just in Ireland, but actually in the European institutions. It had a devastating psychological impact on loads of the staff who were in there, who bought into that Europe was a peace project, that they were for good, that we're the Democrats, we're out spreading values, we don't have interests, and all this kind of thing. And then they saw Ursula von der Leyen green-lighting a genocide, and not just Ursula von der Leyen on her own, but all of them towing in on that. And they just folded. And that was so shocking to people. And I mean, I remember at the time after October the 7th, and quite quickly, obviously, the casualties started mounting, way more Palestinians being killed, and the institutions decided to have a minute's silence for the Israeli victims of October the 7th. And we went and we demanded an immediate meeting with the Parliament President. In fairness, she did meet us and all this. We said, you cannot do this. You cannot do this. You have to have it for all victims. Maybe that was 5 days on or something. We were ignored. We sent a letter around to all the MEPs, an open letter asking them to join, to say, not that we didn't say don't commemorate the Israeli victims. We said commemorate everybody if you're doing your minute's silence. And in the end, they didn't, and they stood shoulder to shoulder with the Israeli ambassador and all of them out, and the 27 countries were all in attendance, including our own. But one MEP, and he was from Italy, signed that letter and did a thing saying, I agree with Claire and Mick. Imagine. So that has been, more than anything, what has shaken people's belief in the European Union. I think Palestine has been the big one, because, even up to then, their total hypocrisy of, every parliamentary session was lecturing other countries around the world about, we're the good guys, we're in the fight of democracy against authoritarian regimes, and then you enable a genocide.
Would you say that the European Parliament and the European institutions are corrupt? Would you go so far as to say that? Like that, not only on these kind of issues that come around, like Israel, Palestine, but that in a deep sense that they're beholden to capital, to the military-industrial complex, to American imperialism?
Oh, they totally are. I mean, there's no question about this. I mean, the whole history of how Europe moved to giving such vast amounts of money to the military-industrial complex came out of a body that was called a group of personalities, which was made up of a majority of the owners and the vested interests of the major arms companies, and they decided that the best thing that Europe could do to make itself safe was spend more money on arms. And then they got the contracts for that, they patented them, which European taxpayers paid for, and sold them back. And it's been an absolute escalation since then. Obviously, the war in Ukraine giving them an open checkbook. So that type of corporate influence is there everywhere. We would have seen it with the question marks around the Pfizer deals, Ursula von der Leyen and the missing text, but big business dominates. We've used the figures before, 60,000 official lobbyists registered in Brussels. Obviously, there's way more than that. And what do they do all the time, and who pays for them? Because they've really nice offices and all of that. So what you have now is a European Union that's a little bit like, well, they thought they could make a United States of Europe. That would never happen. 27 countries, different histories, all of that. But it has in its operation become like the US, where the citizens are completely divorced from those making the decisions. So at least here, you might know your TD, he lives on your road, or whatever, you know who he is. Nobody knows who's in the European Parliament. The Parliament has precious little power anyway. It's basically a retirement home for people who did their time in the member states. So we had former prime ministers with us, former generals, all the rest. They get big money. And then you'd have political parties who maybe put young people on a slate, nobody knows who they're voting for, and the young people go in and the party takes the money. And actually nobody represents the interests of Europe and the citizens of Europe. They either use the money for building their parties at home or just on themselves as a reward. And so the people calling the tunes are those big corporations at all levels of policy. They're the ones who they're answerable to. They're surrounded in this little bubble. They never meet people outside. And that's and you look at voter turnout, less than 30% in about 7 or 8 countries for the European elections. So would it be corruption? There's obviously been many examples of blatant corruption, as in cash in bags or in attics and all of that. We've had a number.
The Azerbaijanis, that laundromat.
So there would be, we're giving these talks about how you spot if you're being corrupted, how do you spot, it's just absolutely pathetic, like you're kind of going, if a beautiful woman comes in, and you're looking around at all these old lads going, now lads, if you don't know that there's something up now, there's really something wrong with you, but anyway, but no, there would be insidious, and despite all their perks, they're brought off on trips, they're looked after. We know of certainly examples where they've got cash payments in that and all the rest. That would be pretty normal for a lot of them, and they would see themselves as entitled to that. And we do know as well, because a lot of countries, unlike Ireland, people vote for parties, but an individual can go up in Ireland, but a lot of the European countries, they're done on these, what they call a list system. So you vote for the party, you'd be voting for Mary Lou or Micheál or whoever, but who you'd be actually getting will be written on a list, and you mightn't know any of them. We know of people in countries who had told us that they paid to go higher up on the list, because the more people votes that party gets, the more seats they get. So we know of people who basically said, well, if you put me up on this list, I'll give you a couple of grand every month. And they were literally paying every month. So that'll tell you what other money they were getting to get on that. So is that corruption? I'd call that corruption.
I'd call that corruption too.
So the short answer to your question is, Harry, yes, I do believe I would call it corruption. And it's certainly total subservience to the interests of European capital. And not all of it, because they've even messed that up, because European capitalism is in dire straits, but it is that servility to US empire and that as well. And this idea now that there's a breach, there was always a battle. as to how Europe would organise itself. Would we be the little, part of NATO and subservient that way, or would we have our little own army? But now it's very firmly kind of in NATO, even though Trump has, fractured that a bit. But, they've said it time and again, the EU is NATO. That's why it expanded.
Yeah.
It wasn't about bringing democracy and peace to the poor Eastern Europeans. It was about taking their workers, all their young people have exited out for jobs in the West, and getting them into NATO.
We have enough to talk about for about 3 podcasts here, but we have promised to let you out about now. So we're going to have to finish it up there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a million.
My
Claire,
pleasure.
for
Keep up
coming
the
in.
good work, guys.
You can email the party line at theditchpartyline@gmail.com. Keep up with The Ditch, obviously. Donate, subscribe on theditch.com. We know some of you, particularly those of you on the Ditch WhatsApp group, were with us at the launch party for the Whistleblower Cafe on South Ann Street over the weekend. So if you weren't there, or if you haven't seen it, do call in, get some coffee, and browse the bookshop. Watch out over the next couple of weeks for the Ditch Whistleblower Sessions, bonus episodes based on some of the great events that were on during that excellent day on Saturday. Thank you for joining us so much.
Thanks a million, lads.